War is hell, as General William T. Sherman said. He would know, since he was an expert at making it that. War is savage and demented. It is never amusing. It is not comical in the least. Of wars in recent history, among the most demonic was World War I. The total number of combat deaths in World War I was about 10 million, with an equal number of civilians. The fatalities resulted from combat and from famine and disease, including the flu epidemic. In addition, 23 million were wounded, and an unknown number of others, both soldiers and civilians, were psychologically maimed for life by the trauma of having lived through it. Yet somehow that 5-year span of living hell produced an abundance of humor. It provided the fodder not only for abject trauma, death, and suffering, but for senseless jokes, inane patriotic songs, countless awful amateur poems, motion pictures, stage productions, costume balls, and clever comics and witty cartoons. A considerable number of those cartoons were and are hilarious. At the same time, others were blatantly racist, were discriminatory toward women, and depicted the enemy forces as monstrous fiends and devilish brutes, whom allied cartoonists and pundits called Bosch, Huns, Krauts, and Jerrys. The richness and variety of humor during World War I may be in part because it extended beyond the time span of that single war. In advance of 1914, when the war broke out in Europe, there were battles already ongoing, consisting of cultural conflicts. Among the most contentious was the controversial premiere of modern art. Cubism, Futurism, and Surrealism were first exhibited in New York in 1913 at the Armory Show. The American public was both amused and outraged by the audacity of modern styles. Not surprisingly, newspaper cartoonists, who themselves were artists, had the most wonderful heyday in poking fun at abstract art. Yet another hot-button issue was the quest by women for some small share of human rights. Back then, they were forbidden to vote, to run for office, to be granted basic property rights, and to access health care options. Women were typically viewed by men as dependent, capricious, and fickle. They were accused of impertinence for suggesting that they were equal to men, while men in turn regarded them as experts in duplicity. It was claimed that throughout history, back to the Garden of Eden and since, women had hoodwinked gullible men. Women had changed their appearance through cosmetics, hair dyes, clothing fashions, and special effects. They had used fraudulent methods to make themselves look younger, more attractive, more desirable in size and proportion. And they had cunningly used their emotions by pretending to be tearful whenever that worked in their favor. There was also the issue of substance abuse in the battle of the sexes, a factor that contributed to the prohibition of alcohol in the U.S. from 1920 to 1933. Were wives and children being harmed by the drinking excesses of husbands? Was alcohol contributive to domestic violence? A typical image of women was that of an assertive wife, armed with a rolling pin, awaiting the late-night clandestine return of her loopy husband, who had been out drinking. In anticipation of being confronted, the husband was shown as resorting to the trickeries of camouflage. How could he conceal his return? How might he counter his wife's attack? Domestic conflicts of this kind were already ongoing, when actual battlefield fighting began in 1914 in Europe. In the first year of World War I, a handful of French soldiers who were assigned to field artillery began to suspect their locations were being disclosed to the enemy by observers flying overhead. Among the soldiers determining this were a few who had been artists and knew how to fool the eye. In response, they adopted disruptive confusion techniques with which to conceal their positions. As this process was applied, it acquired the name of camouflage, while the soldiers who practiced it became known as camoufleurs. Throughout human history, camouflage had long been used for hunting or in combat, but it became a more urgent priority when airplanes became instruments for aerial surveillance, and more so when that was enhanced by aerial photography. To be clear, the French army did not invent camouflage, but it deserves substantial credit, since France was the first to set up a dedicated unit, a camouflage section, that was commanded by artists and was made up of soldiers who, as pre-war civilians, had been trained as artists, architects, and designers. It was easy enough to understand the process of figure-ground blending, as well as mimetic resemblance. But most people found it a challenge at first to believe that a figure might also be hidden by breaking up the figure, by disrupting its continuity, and thereby making it harder to see as a single, continuous unit. This approach to camouflage, examples of which can be easily found in natural forms, was widely used during World War I to confound the appearance of figures. It was especially suitable for ship camouflage, which was popularly referred to as dazzle painting or dazzle camouflage, because it was all but impossible to paint a ship to reliably blend with a constantly changing sky and sea. The American public was fascinated by dazzle camouflage, although they still had doubts about how a highly visible cubist-like pattern could diminish the ease of detection. Cartoonists and newspaper pundits found boundless delight in satirizing ship camouflage, more so perhaps than anything else. Dazzle camouflage, critics claimed, as had been earlier said of cubism, had much in common with crazy quilts. Seeing camouflaged ships in the harbors, the public was reminded of barber poles, harlequin costumes, kaleidoscopes, Russian toy shops, futurist nightmares, unconstrained riots of color, fleets of seagoing Easter eggs, and the effects of exorbitant drinking. According to one journalist, a close-up view of a dazzle camouflaged ship is like looking at a zebra after a session of several hours with a few quarts of champagne. If you can imagine how a zebra would look under such circumstances. It was the wartime equivalent of the drunkard's delirium tremens. A few years later, when the Great War finally ended and prohibition of alcohol was adopted as federal law, camouflage continued to be featured in news articles because post-war bootleggers resorted to wartime camouflage as a means of smuggling alcohol. To the public, this was a limitless source of amusement, and cartoonists switched their focus to civilian applications of camouflage, such as dazzling beach outfits, the design of cars and fashionable hats, and the intrigues of courtship and dating. One of the earliest experts on camouflage in nature and how it might be useful for wartime purposes was Abbott Henderson Thayer, an American artist and naturalist. His initial articles on concealing coloration were published in the 1890s. But in 1909, he and his son, the artist and ornithologist Gerald Henderson Thayer co-produced a volume on the same subject. It would earn Abbott the moniker of the father of camouflage. In the final decades of his life, Thayer kept a scrapbook of camouflage-related bits, such as news clippings, cartoons, and found photographs. Among the items that he saved was a 4-part cartoon created by Alfred Frua that had been published initially in the New York World in 1915. In the first part, not surprisingly, a wife is sitting in a bed, armed with a rolling pin, awaiting her husband's arrival. In fact, he has already arrived but cannot be seen in the bedroom because he is dressed in an outfit that matches the wallpaper. In the second and third parts, overweight wives are having their clothing repainted while already dressed, including the outfits they wear to the beach. Alterations are being made to make the wives look thinner, more shapely, by painting their legs and their clothing. In the final part of Frua's cartoon, the interior of a tavern is shown, with police looking in through the window. But the officers are unable to see the men drinking because they have been painted to blend with the look of the bar and the bar stools. As noted earlier, war is hell, and it may seem incompatible with the delights of jokes and humor. How can they possibly coexist? At the end of World War I, psychologist Stanley Hall addressed that question when he wrote, "Humor is perhaps the best camouflage for fear." In looking over the files of the trench journals of the Allies, nothing has struck me more forcibly than the desperate and pathetic attempts to jest, even about death itself in its more horrid aspects.